Hi, I'm Mina Marcana, General Director of Spoleto Festival USA. Welcome to More on That Now, our virtual discussion series, which explores themes of the 2022 festival. Just ahead, you'll hear three artists and scholars talk about the intersection of art, politics, and cultural diplomacy. Their discussions will focus on what the arts can do to help us understand our politics and our wider cultural context. And they'll also discuss America's role as a global arts leader. In this discussion, you will hear from Kyla-Rose Smith and Paata Tsikurishvili. They are joined by Dr. Hussein Rashid, who is moderating the discussion. Kyla is a musician and sound artist who was a member of a multi-generational Afropop group in post-apartheid South Africa. Currently, she leads a cultural diplomacy group for artists with the US State Department. Paata is based in Virginia, where he is the director of Cinetic Theater. He and his wife, Irina, were arts leaders in their native Georgia before moving to the United States. And leading the conversation again is Dr. Rashid. Hussein Rashid is a scholar on religion in modern America. I thank the panel for this discussion, look forward to it, and hope that you keep up with us on our YouTube channel. Without further ado, more on that now. Hussein Rashid, thank you very much.
Thank you both for joining us for this important session. I think the first question that I want to pose to you, and Kyla-Rose, if you don't mind starting us off with this, is really explaining to me how you think art grounds us in history, or what is the connection between art and history?
Hard hitting, going in with the big questions. You know, I think I have a complex perspective on history to begin with. You know, I think history is in the telling. And then there are many contextual things to consider. Who is telling whose history? And I suppose that I believe that art grounds us maybe the most honestly and truthfully in history because it is a history told by the individuals who are expressing that artistic practice, whatever it may be. So direct from the voices who are living and experiencing that history.
Got it. Paata, what are your thoughts?
Well, I second that, and I would add that, especially according that my culture, so to speak, and I've grown up with, we've learned about ancient Georgian a lot by artifacts found in the Caucasus Mountains on the walls and the rituals. And that also has been translated into the physical rituals, like the hunting rituals. It was staged the way it was. So it's slowly, it kind of tells the story how Georgian history, that binds art with our past. Not to mention the world history and, for example, Egypt and pyramid. And then we see so many artworks on the walls that tells the whole era of these times. Just to summarize that for slowly, and then also the sound. I would say that we have music and the sound and folks from the history that's like centuries old, that it's still passing down to the road, and that sound and music also has that history behind it. So I think without art, there is no the world's history in general.
So if I'm hearing both of you, or as I'm understanding both of you, there is a particular historical and cultural context, Paata, this is what I'm hearing from you, a particular historical and cultural context that gives us specific art forms. And those art forms then carry a particular history or representation of a history with them. So I'm an Americanist, I work with religion in the United States. If I think about jazz, right, that has a particular arc that has to do with race in America, that has to do with religion in the United States. And so it could only come out of the United States. It's a uniquely U.S. art form because of the history that comes behind it. But then, Kyla-Rose, what I'm hearing from you is that art is also a way to retell or tell history. And it's a way to get to a truth that maybe when we think of history and we think of historical narrative, that's one way of expressing a truth, but that too is an art form. History writing is an art form, just like arts is a different type of, when we think of, let's say, plays, Shakespearean plays, for example, or tragedies, but they're also based on histories. And what is he trying to get at with those works? Am I understanding both of
I
you
think
correctly?
that's totally right. I think the experience of living is spectral in the sense that there are many facets, and that perhaps art as a medium is one in its poetry, in its what do I want to say, like maybe not linear expression, is maybe more able to encapsulate that experience of what it means to be human in the world today, and also as a way to look at what it has meant to be human in the world over generations and centuries.
Yeah, art has many forms. I mean, it's a one thing when we talk about art, and it's and depends what we really imagine. But art has really many forms. It's painting, it's music, it's architecture. It's in there, or ancient times founding the cups and the glasses or any jewelry. If we just stop talking about the past, but even think about today, you can tell how much art is integrated our daily life. Just to mention, for example, metaphors and symbolism, right? You see on the street Big M, McDonald, and then immediately you have the whole menu is running in your head, right? You have broad information, the whole story. If you go even farther, like go to politics or go to nowadays, where is the art really plays the big role, is unfortunately it became the propaganda became the art form, because who really conducts the propaganda is also making up the stories and the histories and try to rewrite the past, like the recent events with Ukraine and Russia war. I mean, Russia is trying to, there is no Ukraine history, basically try to erase it from the earth. And that also became the art form. If you really think about it, it has, playwrights, it has directors, they staging it, they executing it, they're releasing it. So multimedia, trolls, boats, if you think about it, it became kind of contemporary art form weapon, so to speak, but it's there. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, art is everywhere. Art is with us, and probably, it will be with us for forever.
Yeah. I'm taken by that point, Paata, about trying to deny Ukrainian history, because obviously the Russians are aiming for infrastructure, right? Power plants and roads and so on. But there's also a concerted effort to go after public art, right? Things that exist on thoroughfares and ways, because that too is an expression of identity. And I think Kyla-Rose, this speaks to your point as well, about the experience of being human. But the experience of being human is universal because we're all human, but is very particular to who we are and where we are. And you can erase people's particularity in their history by going after their art, because there's no way to say, I have a literature, or I have a visual aesthetic, or I have a built environment aesthetic, right? Like you can say this is a Georgian building or a Ukrainian building. You erase that, you efface that. And so I'm taken by the idea, or I'm struck by the idea that art is a necessary infrastructure for defining who we are as a people, right? In the same way that we think about roads. And again, I think architecture is an art form, obviously, but I'm really struck by that idea.
I think it's a beautiful way of putting it, actually. Art is a necessary infrastructure. I think it's also something that in some ways it tends to like subsume efforts of control of culture. Like if I think of where I am from in South Africa, and I grew up in apartheid South Africa, obviously maybe not in the darkest days, or I was not fully aware in the darkest days of apartheid history, but the nationalist government attempted to erase Black culture, attempted to ban books and plays and expressions of art. But at the same time, the period of the 50s through the 80s in South Africa was one of the most like generative, periods for art making, for protest theater, for music, so I think that it's the thing that also rises above and like extends itself beyond the attempt to suppress it more than anything else.
Absolutely. In taking, the history of Georgia, also like name it, like starting from Persians, Ottomans, Turks, Seljuks, Mongols, you name it. When they all came in, and the Russian Empire as well, when they all came in, the first way they did was also attacking artifacts, like for example, churches, and then whatever the ancient paintings and then icons is on the walls was repainted, turned into something else. I mean, anything was like symbolically Georgian and reflected it was Georgian soil, like the Georgian territories, or the country itself was attacked every single time by any enemy. So for some reason, the enemy is targeting the history of the country to raise them off. I mean, that's another thing. And the art is not just on the street, but if you think about it, our symbolism, the country symbolism, the eagle, and the flag, and then you just name it, all details we have. It's such a strong story behind these images. So, I mean, art is in us. It's art is life.
And I think, let me pick up on that point, because I think I hear something that I'd like to explore a little bit more from the both of you. Is, Kyla-Rose, you were talking about apartheid South Africa and the 1980s and this artistic movements that came about. And Paata, you're saying art is life, which again, I think echoes something Kyla-Rose said earlier. But can we spend a moment just maybe talking about art and politics? Is art always political? Let me just ask it in a very generic way, and then I'll drill down. Whichever one of you wants to catch that one first.
Can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I get it.
Is art political? Is art by definition political?
If you ask me, in my opinion, is yes, absolutely. And the reason I'm saying, because I've experienced many different lives throughout before I reached in US, and anything political happened around us, everything was staged. Again, it's propaganda, a message was staged. The war was staged. It was prepared. Somebody wrote the script. There was a timeline. There was a calculation of actors, what kind of props they need, what kind of design they need. I mean, I would say absolutely, there is no way around. I mean, how are you going to plan the war if you don't have the script? And if you don't have the goal, and if you don't have agenda and the objectives? And that's a very similar structure. That's how we do plays. That's how we produce. That's how we produce the art in general. And not to mention that war times, including myself, that like artists, the true artists who really are born as an artist, we get inspired by the situation. So one thing, we get used to it in 3 weeks, the war and sounds and destruction and death and you name it, we get used to it. But it dictates us, what we want to say, how we want to express ourselves. And that's when, for example, painters paint, that's musicians play music, the artist producing the plays that reflects this world. And maybe not just only reflects, but it's becomes the hammer with which to reshape the situation. So it has also the power. We have the power, if we get a strong message out and it reflects to everybody and people connects with, we can also make a changes. I mean, we as in people, as an artist, not just politicians. Yeah, I think so. Artists in politics.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would also say that I think like everything is politics, especially nowadays, like in some ways, like living and defining who you are is a political act, like from gender to the environment. Maybe that's also an expression of like the extremely polarized society that we live in. So even if you're not directly making what you consider to be political art or like issue-based art, if you are dealing with the self and the investigation of the self, then in some ways there is like a a political expression of like your positioning in the world.
Yeah, well, I had the experience working during the Soviet times, working under Soviet Union rules, and we had Ministry of Culture. They were financing theaters, and same times we've been censored all the time. So if there was something against the government and rule, you were executed or you were disappeared out of the earth. So, but they were telling and dictating what type of art to produce, because in the Soviet times, the theater had purpose for propaganda at that time. There was no social media, there was no such a things, but there was a theater that people was spreading the propaganda about the Soviet Union, socialistic country, we are the good and West is bad and kind of stuff. I mean, it's there.
So if I were to think about what I've heard from both of you, there seems to be, I don't want to say two different approaches, but different ways of understanding where art originates from. One is the struggle to express oneself, identify oneself, the individual quest for relationship, that quest for being human and expressing that humanity, and then the question of state control, state power, institutions of art, let's say, rather than individuals of art. And thinking about then maybe politics is thinking about not so much about particular issues, but relationships to power. How do you see yourself vis-a-vis institutions, or how do you relate to institutions? Are you resistant to, attempting to redefine, or in service to institutions of power? Right? So even unmarked art that we wouldn't necessarily consider political, I think, if I'm hearing both of you properly, is in fact political because it's still in service to an institution. So that too is a political act.
I mean, it is according to our institution, my theater company, for example, I'm right now working on this announced the season, and the whole season is dictated by today's political situation around the world. You know, I always looking for those materials that are like problematic or events happening. Either it reflects me or touches me and I want to be part of it and respond or something like that. So the whole season is defined like that. For example, the title of the season we have is Stranger in Strange Land. And every play we line up, the lead character is stranger for this land. And then the stories happen, you know, kind of type of stories. But it was dictated because of the political situation. And then as an institution, so I as an artist, we decided to reflect. And also, I just remember Brecht's famous quote: art is not a mirror to reflect, but a hammer with which to reshape it. So, yeah.
Let me pick up that thread, Paata, which is, as you're thinking about stranger in a strange land, how does art, which is grounded in particular histories, particular genealogies, particular trajectories, right? You know, if I think about the ghazal tradition, which comes out of Persian and Urdu, but appearing in the US, for example, or jazz, you know, the US used jazz diplomacy for many, many years and sent jazz musicians around the world. But these are grounded in very particular histories and very particular backgrounds. How do you make them? How does art become intelligible to people who don't have that historical access, don't have that cultural access necessarily? What is the work that is involved in making that intelligible? How do I understand Georgian theater, for example?
Good question. Cinetic is not a Georgian theater per se. It's just founded by Georgians and run by Georgian artists, but we do the world's classic. That's what we do in general. And I need to say that, like, for us specifically, because we've been part of Persia, we've been part of Ottomans, we've been part of Rome, Byzantium, you know, you just name it, all kind of big empire. We inherited also a culture from part of these regions. Like, we do have influence from Persia in the past. I mean, like, you can find that in our art was influence, or Ottomans, or you name it, even Russians today. So it's all influenced by us. And I think if I understand the dynamics of it in general, The cultural knowledge, of course, for me as in Georgian, I know about the region because it has been passed throughout the oral history from my grandpa's story always flows down. And then what I personally did, and I will not be shy to say that I did manage past 25 years to put Georgian art on the map in the West. Not necessarily doing just Georgian cultural approach only, but I did few Georgian plays, and right now I'm doing it host and guest, which the first time I staged it was after 9/11, September 11 happened in 2001, terrorist attacks. That triggered me that it was kind of moment when I was capable to introduce the culture of Caucasus region, where the Muslims and Christians lived there for centuries. And how do we live there? So it's like very historical. It tells our customs and historical aspect of it. So it's like step by step as in living artist. But there are also artist painters that they also paint their history from the past, right? So that's another the aspect how we can also share our history throughout the world that others also get familiar with. And of course, maybe it's me that I'm interested in the world history, and I always try to dive into any nations, any regions, any continents history, and get more out of them because I love the history. I connect myself with people around the world with knowing their history. Even when I meet somebody that the first time, and then suddenly I can talk about their culture from the past, it creates a different atmosphere, and then our friendship or get know each other happens really fast. We start instinctively kind of know each other. I mean, the history knowledge matters because whom we are today, it's about whom we were yesterday, and then whom we're gonna be tomorrow. It also depends on the past and present.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me, you know, because being a person who's historically from a dispersed diaspora, you know, a Jewish person who grew up in South Africa, who's okay, my grandparents were born in South Africa, so I'm third generation, but there's already like a complex relationship to the country that is my own, and I've never known another one, but like my heritage is Lithuanian, and from Lithuania it's Persian Jews. So it's like a very dispersed connection to like what my cultural heritage is, and my attachment to cultural heritage is an attachment to South Africa, and in many senses an attachment to like a Black tradition of culture, you know, a Black expression of community and humanity. But even that is like a very complex thing to say, considering that I am a white South African who grew up under apartheid. So all that to say that for me, the thing with art is not like a direct translation of tradition that I wish to like impart to somebody else, but rather the ephemeral like commonality of things, of expression, of like some larger ideas of like community and relational understanding of what it means to exist. Again, I feel like I'm harping on the same thing, but maybe, you know, maybe it's more macro for me because I don't have like a clear, like, this is my cultural identity from.
It's so interesting, Kyla-Rose. In my case, in Georgian case, we are indigenous of the Caucasia. And that has totally different dynamics that you just described, Kyla-Rose. And it's very fascinating to see that, like, for example, Georgians' mindset always has been cultural heritage, land, soil, motherland, you know, that's that location and spot that like throughout the history, we were trying to push away hard and ethnic cleansed, but we always came back to it and never really left. We just either died or just staying there. And that gives a different perspective to either observe other cultures or share your culture with others. You know, that's it's very kind of almost like a contained feeling, so to speak, because it's being native and indigenous of the region. It's, we talk about like thousands of years of history.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I think there's also something very beautiful in interfacing with that kind of culture and that kind of like art making. I spent some time in Turkey a few years ago working on a project looking at like singing traditions of displaced communities in Turkey, from like historically displaced like and recent displacement like Syrians to Kurds.
Yeah.
And the way that history exists in these whole stories, or like even in the individual stories that people tell you of like their grandparents or their great grandparents, in the telling of that individual story is the whole arc of history, you know, because people have been in a region for so long that like in your day-to-day experience, like the epic tale of history exists.
Absolutely. And emotionally, it's effective. I would say whatever the story my grandpa told me or their grandpas told me. So that knowledge, like, I don't know, starting from 7th millennium BC, right? I mean, starting from there, and the wars and tragedy and drama and pain, that story we have, right? It created a scar in me emotionally. And its scar is probably looks like never gonna get healed, because it is so easy that I can get irritated or even get pissed off and angry if something suddenly touches that wound against the culture. So I am losing my crazy. I mean, it's interesting how genetically also it also passes down to the generation.
Yeah.
Again, I'm fascinated by this conversation because I feel that both of you are pulling on the same thread, but in two different directions. And so all these things are going off. As you know, Paata, you're ending and talking about this genetic history, this genetic memory, this something that's intrinsic and that's really built in. And then Kyla-Rose, I hear you talking about going to Turkey and collecting these stories. So it's something that's very much an externality to you that you're then, I'm assuming, working on a project with from a musical perspective. And I want to just delve into this question of or this idea of how does art cross boundaries? You know, I mean, I think sometimes we can engage with non-verbal elements of art, right? There's an aesthetic component that we can engage with that can be provocative. And there's a graphic novel by a creator by the name of Simon Tan, I think is his name. It's called The Arrival. It's a graphic novel about somebody who's come into a new country and can't read anything. And there are no words in the entire thing, right? And it's so emotionally impactful, right? And I think about how art, visual art at the very least, works that way. But you can think about oral arts, Kyla-Rose, to your point, oral arts as well, right? So, you know, you've got music, which is obviously very lyrically dense, or can be very lyrically dense, but you can still speak across cultures. And I don't know what the specific question is, but I just love to hear your reflections as creators yourselves. How when you don't have a shared language, right? So I talked about metaphorical language, but even a literal language, how does that work? I just want you to explore that a little bit more.
Well, this project in Turkey is actually a good example, because in doing this research and speaking to women about singing traditions, we discovered, we didn't discover, but we learned of a tradition, a Kurdish singing tradition called dengbej, which is a ballad tradition. And it's a ballad tradition where the songs are mostly written by women in domestic environments, but the performance of them is usually by men. That's also just kind of, you know, society and how things shake down. But, you know, ballad traditions exist across cultures. Ballad traditions exist in Ireland and in Scotland. And we then took some of the work that we did to the Appalachians here in the US, where that music stems from ballad traditions that came with Irish immigrants. So now we had sort of two groups of women who both had an understanding and a culture and an artistic expression of ballad singing. So immediately, the language is not the same, the experience is not the same, but the conditions in which that art is created are similar. They are conditions of like domesticity. They are conditions of community communication, like village communication. Telling the local story of a village is like what happens in a ballad song. You know, someone in the next village got married, so they turned it into a song, and then it becomes like generationally a song that is sung over and over again. And the same can be said for this Dengbej music. So even though words are not the same, we don't have to understand each other. We identify with this like ephemeral like place, this like, I that woman in the kitchen who like has worked her whole life to make a family, and her mother worked before her. I come from thousands of miles across the ocean. Like, that's my life too. That's my life too. And this is also the way I express that experience of my life.
I can tell example about myself how nonverbal art form helped me as an immigrant. When I became a refugee and I ran away, and before that, of course, during the Soviet times, before the Soviet collapsed, right, I was dreaming about America with my wife when I met her there. She's a dancer and then co-founder of the company. So we met there and we were dreaming, and America always has been a dream for us. And we, even that much that we imagined that, the money grows on the trees and life is beautiful and everything is there. So when I eventually moved here in 1995, the reality was that I had a culture shock. And the first year I was almost depressed and I had no idea what to do and how to do it, because whatever I imagined, it was not real. There was no trees growing money on it. And the theaters that were functioning was completely different. It was some kind of American theater is still based on Stanislavski theater system and modified a little bit, kind of familiar. Then, when you go American ballet, if you really think about it, Balanchine, which is, by the way, a fellow Georgian guy, his real name is Balanchivadze in that time. So he was, and so that became inspiration for me, an opportunity when I realized that like I had the skill sets to tell the story without words. And I was trained in it for a long time. And then I looked around and I realized there is no theaters around who's doing the physical theater or nonverbal storytelling. So I felt that was my opportunity, because I had no English. I knew German, I knew Russian, I knew Georgian. I spoke 3 languages, but the English was none. So, and then how I started, so I landed here end of the 95, and then basically 97, I already opened up the studio and I start performing it. And we became successful because of nonverbal art form. There was no borders. There was no more problem about communications. Connection happened easy. And it's interesting to say that, like, because of in the past, I toured around the world a lot. During the Soviet times, I've been everywhere in former socialistic countries and republics. And then when nonverbal presentation was received always same way. So connection was there. It's the only one thing that it's interesting to say that the only one thing I found that like people connect differently is the humor. It's so cultural thing that like, for example, when somebody puts the face in a cake and everybody's laughing, I'm not getting it. Or if I say some joke and I start laughing, my fellow actors or colleagues, they go like, why he's laughing? So the humor is such a cultural thing. So when I toured production in Germany, whatever Germans reacted in French, they never reacted. Humor, but drama, tragedy, pain, war, you name it, it's all same for all of us. Yeah. So nonverbal art, if I may also describe, it's also part of the painting. And the painting is my source of inspiration. It's my foundation. Everything, the way I do the productions is based on the fundamentals of the art. because in the painting, in the art, you have light, you have character, you have color, you have composition, you have blocking, you have sound in it, you just name it in the one painting. So that's a communication. That's how art reflects on us. So the all I do with the nonverbal, the live performances, I always say, like, I'm like a painter. I paint live pictures, live paintings. So it became more like a motion picture on the stage. I'm not saying we are putting up the movies on the stage, but the way we tell the story with the music, with the soundtrack, with action, with visuals, with symbolism, right? So all combined, it's the whole language itself. So I think this is the universal language that I found, that like when I tour in Mexico or New York or anywhere else with the Midsummer Night Dream or any other nonverbal Shakespeare I produced it, everybody receives it in the same level.
Both of you have spoken just now about projects you're involved with, and I do hope people spend some time on both your websites, because you've both had such storied and wonderful professional careers. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on some of the work that you've done, which you've already both hinted at, but maybe be a little bit more explicit on it, on how the work you've done has been used for diplomacy, and diplomacy writ large, either, in the sense that U.S. State Department thinks about diplomacy, or, I think, Kyla-Rose, what you're talking about, the Appalachian communities and the Kurdish communities, sort of cross-cultural interaction more broadly. But if either, both of you would speak to that, and either one of you can go first, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. Well, there's a lot. It's funny that I feel like my whole artistic trajectory has landed up in this world of cultural diplomacy, somehow more officially now, in that I'm the programs director of OneBeat, which is a program of the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, and it's a cultural diplomacy program, and we can speak more about that. But before that, for 15 years, I was a member of a Afropop band in South Africa that started in the kind of early 2000s, a sort of post-apartheid, multi-generational, multicultural band, one of the first of its kind, actually, for the era, for a post-apartheid South Africa era. It was called Freshlyground. We had a huge amount of success, and a lot of that success was to do with this kind of cultural diplomacy, like this in-country cultural diplomacy. We ourselves were sort of an expression of this idea of the rainbow nation of South Africa that Mandela had coined when he came out of Robben Island. And in that period of South Africa, that large swath of the country was very excited about. We had cross-cultural appeal. We were bringing audiences together cross-culturally in a way that hadn't happened in South Africa because of apartheid. And it meant a lot to people. Like, it really touched people beyond like just a pop band, like making songs that people wanted to hear. It was rather that we were something that people wanted to see. And we had a message of like love and unity. And that was a very powerful experience for me, like 15 years of my 20s, and like really experiencing firsthand that like power of art and engagement. And subsequently, I work with Found Nation, and this is the work we do every day. It's the work we do as OneBeat, which is bringing musicians from all over the world together to the US to collaborate on original material, to tour that material. And I'm constantly astounded at the power of cross-cultural exchange. The meaning that people take from it, the depth of experience. We just finished a program, and we sit round in a circle at the end, and people reflect, and people express how this has changed their lives, that it has changed their perception, that it has changed their music practice, this exposure to like other practices, other cultures. And some of the work there is like not even so much about art making, but it's bringing sensitive people together. Like, I think artists are very sensitive people, and we're very curious people. I mean, that's not to exclude anyone in general. Maybe as
Right.
humans, we are actually sensitive and curious, but the artist is the one who's like tapping into that all the time.
Right.
And you bring those curious people together and it creates this like possibility, this other possibility of living together.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's kind of my work. It's where it all is.
Yeah.
So a very apropos question then.
Yeah, art and diplomacy. I mean, in my case, I can say that it played huge role. For example, right now, for Georgian people, we talk about like we are a small nation and maybe like 3.5 million left in Georgia right now. For Georgia, they call me the arts ambassador. That when I started doing theater and putting up art, I was discovered because what I was doing, of course, I grabbed the attention, and then the Washington Post and the other major newspapers, every time they review our productions, it always starts that I am native Georgian, and there is always little story about the Georgia. So like I did expose the Georgian culture to Americans, especially in Washington D.C. And I remember the State Department also kind of supported our initiative to tour in Georgia 2012. And there was the 20th anniversary of U.S. and Georgian partnership and the friendship. And then I was representing American theater. And same times, I was Georgian, so that was a diplomatically used tool, so to speak. That like artists, Georgian American artists with other American artists, not just only American artists, because Synetic is like really based on international talents. So we toured there. So that was a big part of diplomacy about our friendship. And the State Department also has brought many groups to us for Q&A session. I've told my story, how I immigrated here and then how as an artist succeeded, what it took. So it became also interesting for State Department to send like either me or Irina overseas to introduce the American art. And yet, because we are connected with Eastern European art, Western European art, Middle East art, because Georgia, again, is a unique location. So we kind of sucked in all art and then culture during the invasions and those past times. But there is also that knowledge that it's also kind of takes us to the diplomatic levels. Not to mention that like I'm announcing the season opening again with the host and guest responding today's war in Ukraine, because it's Eastern Europe, it's the same region. Our people fighting in Ukraine, and Georgians are dying there for freedom fight. So for us, this war really started in 90s, and whatever you see on TV right now, that's my 90s, and my families, we went through that for 5 years, so to speak. And that's no longer just a war, but as an artist, I think we have opportunity to also voice it out. It's verbally or non-verbally, we can put it up production and express ourselves. And one of the reasons is that art diplomacy, you mentioned it. So I'm trying to organize the Georgian embassy, Ukrainian embassy, Moldovan embassy, ambassadors and diplomats and scholars about the politics and the region, and then create also Q&A session and panels pre or post-production times, and talk about nowadays and culture and customs and humanity in general. So that's I would say the big step, obvious, bold art diplomacy move, so to speak. Yeah.
I come at this as an Americanist, and I think about how the U.S. government has used the arts to project America's vision of the world, whether it's capitalism, democracy. I mentioned the jazz diplomats before, but we see it with hip hop right now. Do you think that U.S. culture, based on both of your knowledge and extensive travels, do you think U.S. culture is still the glamorous or desirous commodity it once was? Are we still the cultural capital, or has Bollywood and Nollywood and local, other regional art forms, musical, visual art forms, have they come into their own? Is there enough infrastructure that American art, or particularly U.S. art, isn't as useful anymore for some of these conversations, or isn't the hook anymore for some of these conversations? I know, the big question.
That's a tough question. I do believe that America is still a culture hub in a simple way, because any successful artists in overseas and the people who was just born for it, so end of the day they all end up in US. For example, what I've done for past 25 years as an art, like I've personally directed 90 plays, and all of them are world classics, right? If I was in Georgia, for example, I never emigrated, so I've never achieved what I've achieved here. There is many reasons. So one thing, for example, it was different aesthetics to work with actors and work with designers. Everything happens here really fast. It's more organized. It's different timetable. Infrastructure around art making is completely different. In the past, I used to work on the one production back in Soviet times, spend like a year, maybe 2 years, and then decide, okay, we're gonna open this show. So because the theaters was funded by government, you had that luxury, for example, that there was no pressure of deadlines. You need to produce new shows all the time. So there was a repertory system. But I would say what was beneficial from that system was, like, artists, we had time to work on ourselves, to experiment, to do this, to do that, and then find things and then throw it away, build stuff, destroy it. You don't have that luxury here. So you have to go. In 5 to 6 weeks, you got to put up like huge production, right? So that's kind of different dynamics and as soon as I figured it out how to kind of keep it up with the tempo and the system, so I would say it's still strongest. But I wish that American art finds the way, for example, like let's say National Endowment. So grants are given. America is only country has no Ministry of Culture. We need to keep in mind every other countries, they have Ministry of Culture, right? We don't. So, and I was wondering, money is tough to find for the artists. It's hard to trust. I see that it's like artists are not trusted with the money to do just experimental work, do something new, figure it out, right? You need to invent. To invent, you need to invest. I mean, that kind of portion to invest in the art is missing. And another thing, what I found is that, like, for example, it will be great if NEA, for example, covers, let's say, at least overhead expenses for the arts, helps a little bit, not just only by selected, who gets privileged, who's not, who has better idea, who has better presentation and stuff like that. Instead of selection process, you say, here is it, and then you experiment. So that way art will grow even faster because of nature of the American way doing the business. So I think that will be very productive. And down the road, what's going to happen in the long run, it will contribute to economy because art will become unpredictable. And art has to be unpredictable. Nowadays, when you go in a theater, more or less, you understand, you expect, and you know what you're going to see it. And it's like you have your knowledge, you go in a theater, you sit down, there is a play, it's Shakespeare or any other thing. That's the way it's staged, that's the light design. So, but how we break this, it's like how many centuries we have to stick with it, right? I'm not saying there is anything wrong with that, but like to really evolve. So, I mean, that's where it comes, the problem I see a little bit. But another hand, I would say the theater, for example, is not as popular or has as much value as it has in overseas. Or I would say maybe actors are not as respected. If you are a star, that's a different story. But everyday hardworking actor is not respected in society as, for let's say, overseas. And I'm not saying it's because we are doing something bad. It's just part of the culture. Like, for example, when somebody is, asking, he used to ask me like, what do you do? Who are you? And I was saying, oh, I'm an actor. And it's like, ha, 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 what you do for a living, right? That was killing me, because in my knowledge before I moved here, I thought, the actor is respectable, the thing, but it's not. But the movies, so you touch that, like the Bollywood you mentioned, like movies. I think movies is that still top notch, but I wish we we Americans here had the access to non-American movies same way we have access here. But it's almost impossible. Why? Because of the infrastructure of the business and money.
Yeah.
But I'm lucky. Yeah, I'm lucky to see. I'm able to go and see the French movies, German movies. Even I manage sometimes to see something from Iranian stuff, Turkish things, the Middle East kind of artworks, right? But Americans has not much.
Paata's really touched on so many important points. I think there's definitely something to be said about the commodification of art in the US on a very grand scale, which, like he says, creates this a cycle of productive artists, the productive artist who has to turn over work and have an audience, and you have to be both your own artist, maker, promoter, you have to, kind of address all of those things. You have to be a business person. But I will say, coming from somewhere else to the US, what I appreciate about this country is the individual appreciation of art, the philanthropic culture that exists in this country on a personal, person-to-person level, that people are willing to give their dollars to an artist, even if it's $10 or $20. That culture does not exist where I come from at all. And the only thing that artists have to rely on is
very true.
Is granting most of that from our Ministry of Culture, which is very complicated, and there's never enough money to go around. And so, yes, those spaces create an environment where the artist just has to do everything for themselves, and that creates an innovation and a different lens and a different time-based practice. But the audience that is willing to support that directly is very hard to come by. And I think in this country, that audience is there. And I think what needs to be innovated is the idea of institutions and the institutions in which art is presented. And I feel that as artists, we can take a model from political funding structures that have come about in recent years of campaigns funded by individual donations, no big money in politics. I feel like as art, it could be wildly innovative to turn to a no big money in art model, where we build institutions that are people-led institutions, that are individually funded institutions, that are community-based institutions, because I think the kind of behaviors are there in American society of people who wish to support artistic practice.
We are approaching our time together, the end of our time together. Is there anything that I haven't asked that you want to speak to as we begin to close out, or any closing thoughts from either one of you or both of you?
Well, I would say that I can tell for sure throughout my experience that art is what unifies the people, and art, has no border. So that's it. That's something that I think, in generally, if we talk about politics or the countries, and then we are looking ahead of us. So I think art should be promoted more, because that brings people together, and it's also share. When you share your culture and you receive other cultures, so you become one. And I think that's also plays huge role. And the reason I'm saying it's Cinetic, that our company based on the troupe, which is not American thing, by the way. It's, there is no troops or ensemble that the theaters has, right? You have the cast, and the show is over and cast is gone. but Cinetic managed to have the troupe for 20 years, and they come from all over the world. They brought in their own culture, and then we created something unique, and that's why it's so valuable, and that's why it's so loved.
Yeah, I thank you for this conversation. I feel like we could talk for a lot longer. I think the sort of like creative living is like what art teaches us, how to live creatively. And I think that that extends beyond if you call yourself an artist or not. I think that we should all embrace a practice of creative living, no matter what we do. So I hope that the work that I'm engaged in, my work, you know, until my time is no more, is something that will espouse that to whoever I meet and come across, and something that I hope that I can hold in my own life is how to live creatively.
Thank you both so much for your time, your knowledge, and wishing you both the best with your endeavors, and looking forward to hearing more about the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great.